Welcome to Novara Live. It's Friday night. I'm Michael Walker and I'm joined by Aaron Bastani. Aaron, have you got that Friday feeling?
Always with you, Michael. Look forward to the rest of this hour.
We do have some great stories coming up. Trump blames D.E.I for the DC plane crash. We'll look at the facts as to what actually happened, but also the politics of disaster under a Trump presidency. We'll also talk about AstraZeneca ditching plans to build a new vaccine plant in the UK. That's unfortunate in a week when Rachel Reeves was talking up her commitment to Britain growing. OpenAI accused DeepSeek of robbery. I get an update on this story. I'm not sure, probably they didn't say robbery, but intellectual theft, I would suppose. They'd probably be more likely to talk about. I talked to a tech journalist about all the latest on that story. And Rory Stewart gets into a flame war with JD Vance. I didn't have that on my bingo card. After a tragic air crash in Washington, D.C. on Wednesday night, we've been delivered a reminder. With Donald Trump back in the presidency, every tragedy will immediately become a political battle. And within hours of the crash between a military helicopter and a passenger jet in which 67 people were killed, the president was straight out of the block, blaming diversity, equity, and inclusion.
I put safety first. Obama, Biden, and the Democrats put policy first. And they put politics at a level that nobody's ever seen, because this was the lowest level. Their policy was horrible, and their politics was even worse. Then my administration will set the highest possible bar for aviation safety. We have to have our smartest people. It doesn't matter what they look like, how they speak, who they are. It matters intellect, talent, the word talent. They have to be talented, naturally talented geniuses. I do want to point out that various articles that appeared prior to my entering office, and here's one. The FAA's diversity push includes focus on hiring people with severe intellectual and psychiatric disabilities. That is amazing. And then it says FAA says people with severe disabilities are most underrepresented segment of the workforce, and they want them in, and they want them, they can be air traffic controllers. I don't think so.
Now, the idea that federal agencies have lowered standards in favor of diversity is one of the core ideas motivating the second Trump presidency. But a journalist present had an effective question, I think, suggesting Trump may have jumped to conclusions.
Mr. President, you have today blamed the diversity elements, but then told us that you weren't sure that the controllers made any mistake. You then said perhaps the helicopter pilots were the ones who made the mistake.
It's all under investigation.
I understand that. That's why I'm trying to figure out how you can come to the conclusion right now that diversity had something to do with this crash.
Because I have common sense, okay? And unfortunately, a lot of people don't.
So it's a good question, because he's saying that in that very press conference, Donald Trump has said, we really don't know yet sort of the details of the crash. We don't know if it was a mistake by the air traffic controller or a mistake by the helicopter pilot or the plane pilot. We really don't know very much at all. But what I can tell you is the ultimate cause was diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's the question put by the journalist. Donald Trump says, well, I've got common sense. There are, of course, alternative explanations for how this crash was able to happen. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted this: I represent LaGuardia Airport as well as workers for JFK. Trump gutted the Aviation Safety Committee last week. Air traffic controllers, already understaffed, got Trump's buyout this week with a 1-week ultimatum to decide. It's not DEI, it's him and Elon too, because Elon Musk was also sort of online blaming DEI. There is also already evidence that the Reagan Airport in Washington, D.C., where the plane involved was trying to land, was understaffed on the night of the crash. So the New York Times has reviewed a report from the Federal Aviation Authority, which stated staffing was not normal at the Reagan Airport Tower. And they say this: the controller who was handling helicopters in the airport's vicinity Wednesday night was also instructing planes that were landing and departing from its runways. Those jobs typically are assigned to 2 controllers rather than 1. This increases the workload for the air traffic controller and can complicate the job One reason is that the controllers can use different radio frequencies to communicate with pilots flying planes and pilots flying helicopters. While the controller is communicating with pilots of the helicopter and the jet, the two sets of pilots may not be able to hear each other. Like most of the country's air traffic control facilities, the tower at Reagan Airport has been understaffed for years. The tower there was nearly a third below targeted staffing levels, with 19 fully certified controllers as of September 2023, according to the most recent air traffic controller workforce plan. That was an annual report to Congress that contains the target and actual staffing levels showed. So the target is 30, only 19 people working there. The shortage caused by years of employee turnover and tight budgets, among other factors, has forced many controllers to work up to 6 days a week and 10 hours a day. So that does, on the surface, sound like a much more plausible explanation than Trump's idea that air traffic controllers may have had severe learning difficulties because D.E.I. told them, or told sort of the bosses of the authority to hire them. This seems like a more data-driven explanation, I would suppose, from the NYT. At progressive investigative outlet The Lever, they've also introduced another potential explanation. So they say, before DC airport collision, lawmakers brushed off warnings and boosted flights. Despite mid-flight near misses and dire pleas, airline bankrolled lawmakers recently expanded flight traffic at Washington's busy airports. It's a story about, lawmakers being lobbied by big business and then making rules or laws in their favor. And that article was co-written by former Bernie Sanders speechwriter David Sirota, who spoke about his story to Democracy Now!
Washington National Airport is a relatively small airport and one of the busiest, if not the busiest airport in the country because of how close it is to the center of Washington, D.C., the city there. For years, there has been a debate about whether to expand the amount of flights that can go into Washington Reagan Airport. And over the course of a few decades, there has been a steady increase in the number of slots, that is to say, the amount of traffic at Washington National Airport, air traffic. And just a few months ago, as we reported, that debate over how much to expand Washington National hit a fever pitch in Congress. There's been a push by a set of airlines to expand those flights. There's some other airlines that don't want to expand those flights because they're already controlling those routes. So there's a sort of an economic battle going on, who gets to control what routes. But at the core of it, according to opponents of this, including the senators that you mentioned, there is a very deep safety concern at this airport because there had been a series of near misses, near collisions at the airport because it is so heavily trafficked. So a few months ago, put into the FAA authorization bill was some language that further expanded these slots and also the perimeter. That's the length of the flights that are allowed to come into Washington National. Basically, this is the opponents argue this is Congress people from cities farther away from Washington want more direct flights into Washington because it's more convenient for them.
So that was David Sirota in that clip, sort of highlighting that it was Washington lawmakers that wanted more flights into that airport because it was more convenient for them. Also, as I said before in the article, they're also suggesting some of the lawmakers were funded by the airline industry wanting more flights for obvious reasons, because that would increase their profits. Lots of the analyses we've just shown you came out in the first 24 hours after the crash. They're all quite immediate. There have been two developments today, though. CNN has accessed two videos of the crash.
The first video we want to show you, the bright light that you see at the top is the American Airlines jet as it approached the runway. Then you see the helicopter flying directly into the frame and directly into the plane. Both aircraft immediately then crashing down into the Potomac River. The second video, it appears to be surveillance video from the airport and showing very same helicopter moving along the river as the plane approaches the runway at DCA, and then the collision and the explosion.
The New York Times has also spoken to a number of sources suggesting that what went wrong was that the military helicopter was flying too high. So this is from the MIT. Before a helicopter can enter any busy commercial airspace, it must get the approval of an air traffic controller. In this case, the pilot asks for permission to use a specific predetermined route that lets helicopters fly at a low altitude along the bank of the east side of the Potomac, and that's the lake, a location that would have let it avoid the American Airlines plane. The requested route, referred to as Route 4 at Reagan National, followed a specific path known to the air traffic controller and helicopter pilots. The helicopter confirmed visual sight of a regional jet, and the air traffic controller instructed the helicopter to follow the route and fly behind the plane, but the helicopter did not follow the intended route, the people briefed on the matter said. Rather, it was above 300 feet when it was supposed to be flying below 200 feet, and it was at least a half mile off the approved route when it collided with the commercial jet. Aaron, neither of us are experts on flight routes of either commercial jets or helicopters. So I suppose I wanted us to focus on kind of the politics of this. And I think one thing that's so clear, the moment Donald Trump is back in the White House, is that everything over the next 4 years is going to be so highly politicized. If Biden had still been president, I think we probably would have heard lots of government officials talking about how we need to take some time to work out what happened. You might sort of get a technocratic explanation and saying we're going to have to reform this or that so that this doesn't happen again. Because Trump is president, you've got him standing up there and saying, this is all because diversity, equity, and inclusion. Then you've got AOC on the left saying, no, it's all because of budget cuts and because Donald Trump has sacked all of his political enemies. And the whole thing just immediately becomes this bun fight, which is fabulous for political journalists, probably quite exhausting for the American public, potentially quite traumatizing for the people who've lost loved ones in this tragedy. What have you made of sort of what we've witnessed over the past 48 hours?
When I first saw his response with DEI, he has also offered his condolences to families. You have to really look for it, but he has done that. He called it a moment of national mourning. But when I heard his response, the first thought that came to me, Michael, I have to be honest, was genius. Genius. Of course he's blaming DEI. And that instinctive bullshit is extraordinary. I mean, that's why he's prevailed twice in presidential elections. And that ability in real time, Michael, that's the thing. It's not like he got his inner circle, his retinue. They take a step back. A couple of weeks later, they formulate some kind of framing, right? That's how most politicians work. They have the focus groups. They have the ad campaigns. They have the press people. They have the strategists. They have the external communications people come in. Trump, in his little head, comes up with this stuff really, really quickly, managing to weave in a real-time news story into a broader narrative which suits him and which he's repeated for years and which he will continue to repeat for years. And I'm sorry, but that is incredibly effective. And it's very intelligent. I obviously don't agree with it. It's outrageous that he's done it. I don't like it. But it's also kind of a singular genius in politics that I can think of. There's nobody else like that. Even, Bernie Sanders, who I've seen speak in the flesh, very charismatic, very intelligent man, just boom, like that on his feet to respond like that is, I think, actually kind of unique in Western politics. So when people talk about, this is the new right and, the Republicans and the Democrats, all true. And of course, you need to think about that right-wing scene, that coalition that's been built around Trump, for sure. JD Vance, for sure. Maybe one day he'll be, inside the Oval Office. But Trump, and I think this really bears it out, this story, is a singular, unique, sui generis is the word, political figure. There is nobody else like him. And I think the fact that he's gone to his safe place of doing this kind of thing so quickly in his presidency is interesting, because I do think, Michael, lots of people who were on the fence, who maybe didn't vote for him in 2016 but voted for him this time round, thought it would be maybe funny, or he's quite captivating, or well, the Democrats are awful, who cares? I do think lots of those people will probably be quite tired of this stuff after a few years. It doesn't mean they won't vote for the Democrats, by the way, who I think are cooked. But this default of his, I think will be quite tiring for quite a few people quite quickly. Of course, that MAGA base, they love it. This is the worldview that they have themselves. But I do wonder, like you say, Michael, there is the overhead here, which is people just get exhausted of this stuff. It's every day, every week, every month for 4 years. It gets very exhausting. Then again, he's not running for re-election most probably, right? So maybe that means he's going to double down on this approach. We're going to see more of it than ever before.
So I want to talk about the DEI issue in a bit more detail. And I have to be clear, that's not because I think it's a legitimate explanation for why this crash happened, but because I suppose on this show, we know more about politics than we do about air travel, which is why we're going to focus on the politics of this. And the DEI issue is going to be something that keeps coming up because, as you've said there, Aaron, this is something Donald Trump really seems keen to hammer home with. The Democrats have a bit of a problem because they don't seem to know how they want to respond, or at least the sort of broader left don't. I'm going to show sort of two types of response. And this, again, isn't related to the crash. This is from before the crash. This is Hakeem Jeffries. He's the leader of the House Democrats. And he said this earlier in the week.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion are American values. Perhaps I can explain. The motto of the United States of America is E pluribus unum, out of many, one. That's diversity. The 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, one of the most important amendments in our country, provides equal protection under the law. That's equity. In this country, we pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, a flag that we just presented to the new president and vice president. And in that pledge, we promise one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. ALL. That's inclusion. Not complicated. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are American values. It's about economic opportunity. It's about merit for everyone based on what you know, not who you know.
So that was Hakeem Jeffries. He's leader of the House Democrats. So we can presumably sort of infer that's somewhat the sort of official party position of the Democrats. Some on the left, though, and I find this really interesting, have been less keen to rally to defend DEI. So I'm going to show a few examples. Founding editor of Jacobin, Bhaskar Sangara, is one of them. He tweeted this in response to that video we just showed you there. Hakeem Jeffries has done more than any other Democratic leader to promote primaries against Democratic Socialists elected and generally smear them, or to Democratic Socialist electeds and generally smear them. These are the DEI defenders. Ryan Grimm from Dropsite News was equally critical. He's not responding to Hakeem Jeffries here, but just in general. He says, people need to understand that DEI was a corporate scam that had nothing to do with genuinely expanding diversity, equity, or inclusion. It had no roots in the civil rights movement and was used more often as a shield against genuine civil rights efforts. What sucks is that the right is going to use its win against DEI to also unravel civil rights gains. MSNBC contributor Rotimi Adeyoye also weighed in. I remember being in an DEI training at an old job, and some weird lady running it was telling people that when you make a new friend, if they are black, don't immediately ask about their families because a lot of black people come from broken homes. Made me hate DEI. It's very stupid. And there was also today, I think, a really interesting development. So this is in the race to be chair of the Democratic National Convention, so to sort of be chair of the party, not necessarily as sort of powerful as being the General Secretary of the Labour Party here, but nonetheless significant. The most obviously left candidate is a man called Faiz Shakir. I say most obviously left because he's a senior advisor to Bernie Sanders. Now, this is a tweet about the contest to become the DNC chair from a Washington Post reporter. He says, at DNC Chair Forum, Faiz Shakir splits from other candidates in declining to commit to increasing at-large DNC seats for transgender people and creating a Muslim caucus. And then there's a quote from Shakir saying, I'm frustrated by the way in which we utilize identity to break ourselves apart. Aaron, is this interesting? So you've got sort of the mainstream Dems, it seems, all sort of doubling down on sort of talking about identity. And it seems now that at least parts of sort of the Democratic left are quite keen to get away from sort of identity-based distinctions and saying, let's talk about class, or let's just sort of talk about universal interests more generally. What have you made of this?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, Michael. I think what Hakeem Jeffries was saying was just outlandish. The idea of e pluribus unum, meaning therefore multiculturalism and diversity, is basically the complete opposite of what that sentence is meant to mean. America, the United States, is a republic, of course, and the whole point of e pluribus unum, from many one, is that people come from different backgrounds, different belief systems, but fundamentally they are citizens of the same republic. And that is precisely the argument that somebody like Trump would make. Yes, we are an indivisible republic, therefore we don't fragment and we don't distinguish along the lines of race, religion, gender, etc., which is their critique of positive discrimination. Not that I agree with it, but that's their critique. And I think the idea that e pluribus unum, this quarter of a millennium old line, which really is the epitaph of the American Republic, I don't think that's an argument for DEI. I think that's quite stupid. Park that for a moment. I do think it's probably quite a profitable line of attack for the Republicans. I think that's why Trump's obviously done it. And I do kind of agree with Ryan Grimm's analysis that it's going to be used to undermine really important civil rights legislation, stuff that anti-racists and, fundamentally Democrats, and I mean that as in people who believe in democratic politics, a liberal democratic society, things that these people fought for decades. There is a tweet as well. Somebody said that when Republicans say DEI, they mean the N-word. There's something to that. But I also think often when you get these counter-revolutions, as we're now seeing really against DEI, there's also a kernel of truth to it, right? Which is that lots of this stuff wasn't particularly authentic. It wasn't really driven, like I said, by anti-racist movements. Often it was kind of, fuzzy politics, whether or not you agree with it. And I do think we're now in a moment of kind of overcompensation. So, I remember walking past Coots a couple of years ago, bank to, at that time, the Queen, right? And on the front of Coots, you had, like a pride thing, and people saying how great Coots is. And I'm thinking, as a socialist, I don't think the banker to the Queen is good, right? I don't think that she's at the apex of a system of profound income, social, and political inequality. I don't, just because they put a rainbow on the front window, I don't think that makes them like people on my side. I'd rather them be homophobes, but it's not like a politics that I'm willing to get on board with and defend and say this is fantastic, it's progress. Fundamentally, I think it's quite meaningless, actually. But I now think there's an overcompensation against lots of this stuff. So if you look at, for instance, DEI in this country, in the UK, the NHS has DEI officers, and they get paid quite well, some of them. Again, I'm not commenting really on how much they're paid and whether or not they deserve that, but some of them are paid quite well. Recently, people brought up a DEI job in the NHS, and they were on, I think, £90,000, significantly more than the head of cybersecurity at the Treasury. And people are saying this is a stupid job, get rid of it. Now, I don't know whether or not it's a stupid job, and I don't know whether we should get rid of it. But the idea of DEI, and for instance, the NHS as one example, doesn't just mean who are you recruiting. It also examines why do Black women suffer the injustice of being 4 times more likely to die in childbirth or within, I think, the first year of childbirth than white women. 4 times. That's really significant, right? And I say that as somebody who is very keen to emphasize and focus on class-first politics, but there's something going on there, and we need to get to the roots of it, and that needs to be resolved. That's clearly a profound injustice that I think people, whether they're on the left or the right, should care about, frankly. So the idea that you would then get rid of people whose job it is to work out why you get that kind of inequality, and actually that kind of inequality doesn't matter. The idea that you'd get rid of that and dismiss it and discard that as something we should care about, which we should, I think is very, very bad. So yes, I've got a critique of DEI. I think lots of it's a waste of time. I think it's effectively woke washing for big corporations. You had ESG as well. ESG scorecards, and Goldman Sachs would be giving various investment opportunities in ESG score. Goldman Sachs, really? Again, this organization at the top of the pyramid in regards to overseeing and coordinating profound and ever greater levels of inequality in our society. The idea that Goldman Sachs are the good guys is patently absurd. And of course, anybody with a brain who thinks they're on the left shouldn't be saying that. But there is nuance here, Michael. So in short, I don't think it's something we should be defending. ESG, DEI, these aren't left-wing things. They never came from left-wing demands. But at the same time, I think we need to be aware that in this overcompensating moment, lots of people attacking DEI, attacking ESG, are actually attacking things of profound importance and which people have been fighting for the best part of a century. This didn't start last week.
In a week in which Rachel Reeves pledged to go all out for growth, this will be a real blow. AstraZeneca has today scrapped plans to build a £450 million vaccine plant in Merseyside. The Times report this. The FTSE 100 company said that following protracted discussions with the government, we are no longer pursuing our planned investment at Speak. A spokesperson for the Cambridge-based business said several factors have influenced this decision, including the timing and reduction of the final offer compared to the previous government's proposal. AstraZeneca's decision to cancel the investment plans at its site near Liverpool comes after the Times this month reported that delays in securing government support had led AstraZeneca to miss a key internal deadline. Despite the business secretary being warned privately that it was an urgent issue, it follows mounting frustration internally with the government's handling of the process. So from sort of that part of the article, it sounds like this was the Labour government dropping the ball, right? This is the kind of investment we really want, right? In the high-tech medical sector, vaccines are good. This is the kind of investment we want in the country. It's not just sort of foreign billionaires buying up houses or sort of infrastructure. This is a real investment. So this seems like a blow, a loss. However, there potentially are two sides to this story. So this is from later in the article. So it says, Sir Pascal Soriot, the group chief executive of AstraZeneca since 2012, was critical of the UK's fiscal and operating environment towards the end of the Conservatives' time in government. In February 2023, Soriot blamed a discouraging tax rate for the company's decision to invest in a $360 million manufacturing plant in Ireland rather than Britain. So to me, that sounds like, this is a company who is just looking for the jurisdiction with the lower corporation tax. And I don't really want us to be sort of in a race to the bottom competition with a bunch of other countries as to who can offer these companies lower corporation tax. Let's go to the statement from the Labour government as well. They say, a change in the makeup of the investment originally proposed by AstraZeneca led to a reduced government grant offer being put forward. All government grant funding has to demonstrate value for the taxpayer, and unfortunately, despite extensive work from government officials, it has not been possible to achieve a solution. So apparently, my understanding is that the Conservative government originally had offered £90 billion in grants, I think 70 billion to build the factory and then 20 billion for research. Labour then, when they got into power, they say the offer had changed somewhat. I'm not exactly sure. Maybe it was something to do with the bit they moved to Ireland, but they sort of moved that down to 40 billion. They've been renegotiating since then, trying to meet somewhere in the middle. And obviously those negotiations have broken down. Aaron, what's your take on this? I mean, it's obviously bad news for the government, probably not good news for Britain, right? I want more vaccines manufactured here. It's exactly the kind of thing we want to be building. At the same time, I don't feel like I know enough to say this was the Labour government's fault. What are your thoughts?
Well, Michael, you should know enough. It's your show. I want an opinion from Michael Walker on this. I think you probably have some opinions, Michael. I might try and solicit them from you. I think fundamentally the government has to make this happen. We're coming out, 4 years now from the COVID pandemic. We were in the extraordinary situation, Michael, 4 years ago, of waiting on imports of vaccines from overseas. India, I think at one point, was meant to be sending us millions, and we were waiting on them. The idea that you don't have entirely endogenous production of very important vaccines, which can be turned around very quickly for potentially new pathogen, I think is insane. I would have thought, Michael, that would be the one lesson that our political class would take from COVID, if nothing else, right? And of course, people watching and listening right now or later on probably remember the whole political class, including Keir Starmer, right at the peak of COVID. We're never going back. It'll never be the same again. Things will never be the same again. Well, guess what? Things got worse. And they're not even that keen. They're not even really, really making a beeline to make sure that vaccines are produced in this country. If we have to subsidize it extensively, of course we should. If that means we get some equity, a tiny sliver of equity in AstraZeneca, go for it. Absolutely, we need the production capability of vaccines, which we have for some things, but not for others. But we need a significant manufacturing capability of vaccines in this country, which we presently do not have. And so it's a political priority for Labour to look good, sure, for the short-term, medium-term electoral cycle. But in terms of the country's national security, and that's a word and a phrase that politicians love to use, right? Trident national security. Having endogenous production capabilities for vaccines is more important to this country, I would argue, than Trident. You might think they're both important, but guess what? The vaccines are more important. So yeah, it's immensely disappointing. And just to make a final point here, Michael, COVID-19 was the third novel coronavirus of this century, right? There were two prior to that, SARS and MERS. There will be more. There will be more. Andres Malm wrote a great book about this, right in the teeth of the COVID pandemic. There will be more because, of course, we're living in an ever more globalized world. So pathogens can get around the world even more quickly and more ferociously than ever before. And also because of the climate crisis. COVID-19 originally was a pathogen which came from another species. This was subject to what's called zoonotic spillover, when a pathogen goes from one species to another, often via an intermediary species, i.e. one species eats another, and then that's eaten, or sometimes through feces, etc. This will happen repeatedly. It'll happen more and more. Now, hopefully, they won't be particularly bad pandemics. Hopefully, nothing worse than COVID-19 at the very least, but they could be. And these are the exact kinds of things that governments should be preparing for. So for me, it's almost like it's emblematic of the political class who, like I said, 4 years ago, was saying, we will never, ever go back. We're going to make sure this never happens again. They're letting it happen again. And I think, you know what? I think that is not the approach of someone like China or even Vietnam, right? Or actually, I think of the United States. I think the United States with Operation Warp Speed is probably in a better place now than it was 4 years ago. Is Britain? I mean, I don't know. Maybe this time we have masks that actually work. You know, maybe we have like PPE kit stored somewhere. You know what? I wouldn't even be surprised if we didn't.
Yes, I suppose the only thing I'd sort of come back to that with is you were sort of saying, you know, let's just give them all the money. Maybe they'll give us a slice of equity. And to me, that seems like that's assuming quite a lot, right? Because AstraZeneca, if the Labour government said to AstraZeneca, we'll give you all this money if you give us a slice of equity, they'll say, well, fuck it, we'll go to Ireland, right? So you've got a kind of, if they're competing and they're just willing to go produce it in Ireland, then that does put the government in, they don't have as much bargaining power as they can just demand some equity. I mean, this could be an argument to say we should have just built a publicly funded vaccine manufacturer sort of in partnership with a university instead of having to beg AstraZeneca to do it. But it doesn't seem as simple to me as saying that we must have been able to sign some kind of deal with AstraZeneca that would have been in the interests of the taxpayer or the public in general. Because if they're playing off us against, I mean, the US, Canada, Ireland, etc., then, you know, governments do end up in a race to the bottom, which isn't always, you know, they could easily have ended up agreeing to something that we then criticize them for. Do you see what I'm saying?
No, and I would respond to that very quickly. So I think the idea of having equity in AstraZeneca as some kind of exchange might initially be a bad deal. It might be a financially bad deal. But the point is, I think it's mission critical for national security to have this kind of thing here. And I think in the long term, you're absolutely right. I think the idea that you basically give sweetheart deals to multinationals and big corporates because of infrastructure your country needs, I think that's obviously mad in the long term. That's where we are. I think fundamentally, you know, you need an approach probably like China in the short to medium term, which is you come to quite accommodating agreements with private sector enterprises, and then you view these areas as areas of strategic national interest. You know, that's how China built its EV industry. They got Tesla over, they did a great deal with Tesla. Tesla were loving it, and they learned everything they needed to learn. They got engineers trained, and guess what? China created BYD, which is going to kill Tesla, I think, ultimately, as an automotive manufacturer. So I agree with you. I think ultimately you do need some kind of state-owned enterprise to be doing this instead. Are you going to be able to build that from scratch? No. And I think even if you had a socialist government in charge, Michael, let's say to the left of Jeremy Corbyn, right? Let's say you had a left-wing Lee Kuan Yew in charge of the UK, you wouldn't be able to do something like that overnight. You would have, you know, it will that to train the people, you know, to train the management, to train the requisite researchers, etc., to create a kind of national institution which people feel proud of, which can deliver, which has high levels of competence and quality. That will take 10, 15 years to build, right? So I say this as somebody who takes pandemics as a really serious threat to national security. Like I say, we have these deals with BAE. BAE, by the way, wouldn't exist without the contracts it has with the British Armed Forces. It wouldn't exist, right? You know, and there's loads of inefficient deal making done with BAE, which are not in the taxpayers' interest to keep this alleged company of national interest above water, keep it surviving. You know, I do feel like we've just kind of forgotten that pandemics are probably a greater threat to national security certainly than a conventional war, right? A conventional war is not a problem for this country. A nuclear war, obviously, with warheads coming from Russia, that's a major problem. But in terms of millions of people dying in Britain as a result of a conventional war, highly, highly unlikely. Famous last words. With a pandemic, it's plausible, right? It's plausible. And we should count our lucky stars that we didn't have a repeat of, the 14th century with the Black Death. That's not happened. It could. It can. It's not implausible. It's not likely, but it's not implausible either. And the first job of politicians is to keep people safe. And so, it might not be a great deal initially, but I think it's pretty justified.
I do have a memory of sort of immediately after the pandemic there being an announcement for sort of a plan for a kind of publicly run sort of mega vaccine plant. But I was sort of Googling it in the 5 minutes before we went live, and I couldn't quite find it. Obviously, this is quite a news story. I'm sure there'll be some long reads over the weekend telling us a blow-by-blow account of how this deal broke down, and then maybe I'll come to a more firm judgment on who fucked up. The most important story of this week will likely prove to be the shock Chinese company DeepSeek gave to the American tech giants. We covered the story on Monday and Tuesday's shows, but there have been significant developments since then, so I wanted to come back to that at the end of the week. The most dramatic move of the week really was OpenAI claiming to have evidence that DeepSeek used OpenAI's models to train their own product, and that possibility was also put forward by the White House AI czar, David Sachs, on Fox News.
There's a technique in AI called distillation, which you're going to hear a lot about. And it's when one model learns from another model. Effectively, what happens is that the student model asks the parent model a lot of questions, just like a human would learn. But AIs can do this, asking millions of questions, and they can essentially mimic the reasoning process that they learn from the parent model, and they can kind of suck the knowledge out of the parent model. And there's substantial evidence that what DeepSeek did here is they distilled the knowledge out of OpenAI's models. And I don't think OpenAI is very happy about this. And I think one of the things you're going to see over the next few months is our leading AI companies taking steps to try and prevent distillation. And so we'll see if the leading AI companies can prevent distillation by third-party companies. That would definitely slow down some of these copycat models.
So that was David Sachs, AI czar, an investor, I think, before he joined the Trump campaign. On Wednesday, OpenAI's biggest investors also got involved. So Microsoft, who have a $100 billion stake in OpenAI, have launched their own investigation into whether DeepSeek obtained OpenAI data. And by Thursday, there was some positive news for OpenAI. So Japanese bank SoftBank has said it will invest up to $25 billion in the company, which would give it a $300 billion valuation. To talk about all these developments, I caught up again with tech journalist James Vincent, and I began by asking him what we should make of OpenAI's claim that DeepSeek trained their models off of theirs.
So the training technique they're talking about is called distillation. And although it is, a complex thing to do in terms of engineering, it's conceptually very simple. You take a large model, you put your inputs in there, and your questions, or at a higher abstract level than that, and you take the knowledge it gives you, and you feed that into your smaller model, and you basically, you take the information out of it and use it to train it in the same way that you might have a teacher training a student. So distillation is not a fancy thing. It's not unusual or exotic. OpenAI uses it itself in order to make its models smaller. And it's very common practice among the whole industry, particularly among startups and researchers who have a smaller budget, to use distillation. Now, is the accusation credible that DeepSeek used distillation to, steal this knowledge from OpenAI? Yes, basically. It's quite likely that they did it because it's a common training a technique for these sorts of systems. It's unusual that OpenAI obviously is seeding these stories to the press about this being a problem, but that speaks to the panic that DeepSeek's emergence onto the AI scene has caused within the AI companies.
And a common response I've seen online to these allegations from OpenAI is, who is this company to tell people that they've been stealing data? Because, of course, people's image of OpenAI is that what they've done is they've fed everything that anyone else has written on the internet, so books, newspaper articles, journals, and then they've, coughed out their own, I suppose, output based on those inputs that they didn't write. They haven't respected the copyright of people who wrote those original articles. Is that a legitimate sort of critique of OpenAI, that if, who are they to talk about copyright?
I would say it's a legitimate moral critique. The more pertinent question is whether it's a legitimate legal critique, and it's not really. Obviously, I've seen these same headlines as well, and OpenAI being sort of hoisted by its own petard, and there's a certain satisfaction to be gained from that, certainly. But we're talking about two separate legal areas. What OpenAI is alleging is not the sort of intellectual property copyright theft that lawsuits against OpenAI are currently pursuing by people who said, look, you stole my book, you stole my newspaper, you did all this stuff. And those questions, whether that's legal or not, that's yet to be settled in the courts. And there's all sorts of complications with that. But what OpenAI is alleging is a violation of its terms and services, which says very clearly that you can't use our model in this way. You can't use it to train your own models. So those are two different questions, and there is a moral equivalence, certainly, but more importantly, from OpenAI's point of view, there's a very different legal standard being applied in both these cases.
And I mean, having it put like that, violation of terms of service. I mean, if I violate Facebook's terms of service, I just presumably lose my Facebook account. So even if DeepSeek were found to have broken the terms of service of OpenAI, like who cares?
Yeah, I mean, that's it. It's very true. I don't think DeepSeek would care at all. I don't think that if they were found to have violated the terms of service, what would OpenAI realistically do? They would have to work this out basically by tracking down IP addresses, perhaps associated with DeepSeek, the company, and the developer accounts that they would have bought in order to get access to the API for their models. They would shut those down. Fine, that's not really going to do very much. It's not going to stop distillation happening for future models that OpenAI releases in the same ways if they choose to do so, because you just get new accounts. You just hide your pattern of training. You diffuse it through, all sorts of methods to do that. And, China doesn't have to respect these US conditions. They can say, and DeepSeek is an example of this, of course, we're just going to build our own system. We're going to build our own models. We're going to do it our way, and you can't stop us. And they can't.
And so this does sound like a problem for OpenAI. If sort of like you can make a model on the cheap based off sort of OpenAI's much bigger investments, and the only sort of comeback OpenAI have is, okay, we're going to take away your accounts. That seems like their moat isn't as deep as they'd have hoped. At the same time, just yesterday there was a story that SoftBank, the Japanese investment bank, they're going to invest $25 billion in OpenAI. That gives it a valuation of $300 billion. Is this a sign of sort of confidence? People are sort of saying, you know what, we still believe in this company?
I think, OpenAI has built up such a powerful position with so much investment and so much political, backing behind it now, the close sort of affiliation with the Trump administration, that it's still the most powerful AI company by a long chalk, I'd say. The investment from SoftBank, I wouldn't read too much into that. I don't know how much you follow SoftBank's investing strategy, but they're this huge Japanese fund, and they throw money at pretty much everyone. Very famously, they throw a lot of money at WeWork, the office sharing space that sort of imploded under Adam Newman. That's just what they do. Their basic strategy is that technology is always going to keep getting better and better, and whatever happens, we are going to have a slice of that pie. So I wouldn't read too much into that. There's some issue with the timing of it, and they released this news in order to give OpenAI a shot in the arm, just to give them a little bit of a moral push at a difficult time for them. And it's lovely to see that sort of solidarity amongst capitalists. But I don't really think we need to read too much into it now.
And I want to read to you a tweet from Arnaud Bertrand. He's sort of like an entrepreneur, commentator, often on Chinese politics, often sort of puts forward a Chinese perspective on things, which is often very interesting. I feel in a way like I understand this in a different way because of some previous answer you've given, but I'm going to read it to you anyway. So he said, people are rightly ridiculing OpenAI over its accusations of DeepSeek using their output to train their model, but most people are missing the truly terrifying implications here. The far more worrying aspect here is that OpenAI is suggesting that there are some cases in which they own the output of their model. Now think for a minute what this means in the world of tomorrow, where so much will be generated by AI and already is the software code, the emails we send each other, the videos and images. Do you want to live in a future where if for some reason the AI giants are dissatisfied with the way you use the output of their model, they can claim ownership of it? A future where every piece of content touched by AI might be virtually everything in the world of tomorrow, comes with invisible strings attached. The implications for innovation and creativity are staggering. Small businesses and independent developers who rely on AI tools could find themselves trapped in a web of intellectual property claims. Worse, we're looking at a future where the very act of learning and building upon existing knowledge becomes gated by the interests of AI giants. This would be techno-feudalism on steroids. If we don't challenge this now, we risk sleepwalking into a future where human creativity and innovation become the property of a bunch of AI overlords, and a world where they can dictate not only who gets to innovate, but what kind of progress is acceptable based on their own interests. Now, when I read that, that sounded, plausible on the face of it. What you've just explained is that this isn't actually really a claim about intellectual property. It's a claim about whether someone broke OpenAI's terms of service. So they're not actually asserting a property claim just to say you broke our terms and conditions.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's the basic flaw in that argument, that there isn't a specific copyright claim that OpenAI is making in this case, or at least nothing that I've seen. But there is, there's obviously some legitimacy to this idea that if everything is channeled through these companies who have proven to have a very, let's say, acquisitive attitude towards, others' intellectual property and copyright, that there may be some danger of that. I think that danger is exaggerated, because I think, OpenAI's business, or the bits that they're actually making money from at the moment, is selling this stuff to other corporations, to other businesses. Now, is a corporation going to buy, copies of Microsoft Word, for example, for all of its employees, if it thinks that there's going to be any claim over the copyright produced with that tool? No, definitely not. And if OpenAI tried to make that claim, then their competitors, who make maybe not exactly as good products, but pretty much the same quality, would just be able to get leverage over them in the competition and say, look, we're never going to make that claim. So that would be detrimental, I think, to OpenAI's their business going forward. I should also note that OpenAI's terms of service, as well as forbidding what they are accusing DeepSeek of doing, this distillation method, does also grant the user of any of their products copyright over the output of the models. So this is something that hasn't yet been fully tested in courts, and it's something that might end up being tested in some way. But OpenAI's approach to this so far has been to reassure the user and say, look, no, everything that comes out of this, it's yours. That is separate to the legal challenges they are facing, though, over the training of their models. But one interesting aspect to this question is, why exactly is OpenAI making this challenge then? If they don't really have a serious copyright claim to make over DeepSeek and its products, what are they doing? And I think that they have seen all of the panic that this news has caused, the tumbling of the stock market, the reactions from tech leaders, and they are trying to reassure the public at large, their investors in particular, about the importance of their models. Because if they can make the claim, and if they can prove that DeepSeek's models are trained on their own, what they are essentially saying is, look, our models are still really important. In fact, they're so important that they have to be stolen from by our competitors in order to match our capabilities. And what OpenAI will then be able to say after that is, look, okay, fine, we got caught with our pants down here. We didn't tighten up the model, enough that people couldn't exfiltrate this information. But what we're going to do with GPT-5 and 6 and 7 is we're going to lock it down, and we're going to make it super secure. No one's ever going to match it, and we're going to sell it to you for whatever money we think is reasonable. So that's what they're doing. I think they're trying to reassure the public that their models are still incredibly important, that their investments they're making, the huge amount of money, is important to keeping them in the lead, and therefore they're the best, and you're going to want to buy from them in the future.
And in a way, actually, final question. I mean, in terms of the distillation method, as you were talking about it, it's you train your model by asking the OpenAI model loads and loads of questions. Presumably, you can just, if it seems like something is asking so many questions, it could only be training a model. There's no other plausible use for asking, 10,000 questions a day. So I imagine maybe, without being an engineer, stopping this happening again might actually not be that difficult.
Well, I don't know about the exact methods you might use in this, but you could compare it to an activity like web scraping, which OpenAI indeed engaged in order to collate the training data they needed for their models. And what you usually do is you can split the requests you're making through many different IP addresses, and that sort of hides the model. So rather than one person going into a library and stealing the whole contents one book at a time, you have lots of different people doing it. I don't know about the exact details of this, though, and it's purely because this is such an emerging field. And obviously the techniques, if they are being used, if they're not outright illegal, they're certainly shady, and people don't really publicize what they're doing with them. I would imagine, though, that you're right, that OpenAI is saying this because it probably has been able to find some pattern of activity that seems to be, a smoking gun of some sort. But we're going to have to see how this develops.
That was James Vincent speaking to me earlier today. And we also put out an interview with him on Monday. Did very well on YouTube. Lots of people very interested in this story. Aaron, I think you wanted to come in and comment on this story.
Well, I just had a question, really. Is there any evidence that what David Sacks said is true? Because, David Sacks, obviously a member of the PayPal mafia. He's deeply imbricated within sort of Silicon Valley elites. Obviously, he has a deeply vested interest in what he's saying, literally a financial interest. None of these people want to see American big tech and the AI bubble burst. So, I mean, I think there is a big onus here, Michael, to actually corroborate the claim. This is not, he's not a career politician. This is somebody who's, who is besties with Bezos and Musk. I mean, so is there any evidence? How significant is it?
I'm not sure. I don't know, actually. I mean, as far as I understand, OpenAI have said they've said they've got evidence, and other people have said it's perfectly plausible that would have been the case. And I don't think they've published their evidence. But no, it's an interesting point. Maybe it's completely made up. But you'd assume that at some point they're going to have to publish something. Although I suppose it has shored up.
Really?
Well, it hasn't shored up their stock price because they're a privately traded company. Interesting.
Why would they though, Michael? Look at Huawei. Huawei, loads of spyware. Huawei, literally, 5G in this country doesn't work because we boosted out Huawei. There's no evidence, by the way, that they were using spyware on 5G networks in this country. So, I mean, it just seems it's probably a great way of get it off the App Store. This is I've seen this game before, Michael.
It wouldn't get it off the App Store though. I mean, I suppose with Huawei and stuff like that, and actually, I feel the same way about TikTok, which is like I'm very impressed by the Chinese government. I'm really happy that China got rich. It's sort of lifted millions and millions and millions of people out of poverty. You've got millions of people entering a middle class. I think it's fabulous. At the same time, when it comes to technological competition, I find it difficult to get outraged when sort of like, for example, the United States considers banning TikTok. Because if you're in China, you can't use Western social media apps because the Chinese Communist Party obviously thinks it's a security threat to have people using those Western apps. So if we block their apps, to me, it seems sort of like a normal thing for nations with some rivalry to do. And I suppose I know less about the Huawei case, but I feel like it's kind of similar there. I don't think the Chinese would sort of let Western companies build their essential infrastructure. So if we're reluctant to do it, it seems...
I don't think that's true. True.
What do they have that's...
China is the biggest market for Apple, Tesla, and Volkswagen. Like, they have a ton of Western companies there.
But in terms of critical infrastructure, controlling critical infrastructure and sort of things of sort of ideological significance?
Well, we should be like that.
We should be like
what? We should be like that. Well, British infrastructure. The fact that Britain can't build nuclear power stations without the French is outrageous. Yeah, and things like port of entry into a country, your transport infrastructure. Yes, of course, that should be publicly owned. And if you're saying, well, Huawei won't build it, okay, then fine. Then create a British company or a public-private company which can build it instead. Great. In the meantime, have Huawei do it. And that is, by the way, that's exactly what the Chinese did, Michael. They used foreign expertise and they leveled up with their supply chains and their workers' capabilities to build things. And once they did that, go away. We've got what we wanted. Okay, let's do that then. I don't think that's quite true. Without China, Apple is really screwed.
Yeah, but I suppose that's just sort of like tech used by individuals, right? Because obviously the UK government hasn't stopped people buying Huawei phones, right? People are still buying Huawei phones.
It's quite hard to use Huawei handsets in the UK, I think.
Is it?
It's more
on what?
high friction. I don't know what it is. There's high friction. Yeah, I don't know what it is. This is what I've been told, Michael. My people tell me.
Your people tell you it's hard to use Huawei. Hard to use Huawei in this country. This is a Twitter beef I didn't expect to see this week. It's set the Rest of Politics co-host and former Tory minister Rory Stewart against the newly inaugurated Vice President of the United States. So to understand the beef, you first got to watch this clip of JD Vance speaking to Fox.
But there's this old school, and I think it's a very Christian concept, by the way, that you love your family, and then you love your neighbor, and then you love your community, and then you love your fellow citizens in your own country. And then after that, you can focus and prioritize the rest of the world. A lot of the far left has completely inverted that. They seem to hate the citizens of their own country and care more about people outside their own borders. That is no way to run a society. And I think the profound difference that Donald Trump brings to the leadership of this country is the simple concept, America first. It doesn't mean you hate anybody else. It means that you have leadership. And President Trump has been very clear about this, that puts the interests of American citizens first. In the same way that the British prime minister should care about Brits and the French should care about the French, we have an American president who cares primarily about Americans, and that's a very welcome change.
What is President Xi doing? What is Vladimir Putin
He's looking
doing?
after the Chinese. Putin is looking after the Russians. They're entitled to do that. Thank God we now have an American president who's looking after the citizens of his own country.
So when that video was shared on Twitter, Rory Stewart responded like this. A bizarre take on John 15:12-13. Less Christian and more pagan tribal. We should start worrying when politicians become theologians, assume to speak for Jesus, and tell us in which order to love. So JD Vance then responded to that via quote tweet, said, just Google Ordo Amoris. Aside from that, the idea that there isn't a hierarchy of obligations violates basic common sense. Does Rory really think his moral duties to his own children are the same as his duties to a stranger who lives thousands of miles away? Does anyone? And then you can see here JD Vance saying about Rory Stewart, I've said before, and I'll say it again, the problem with Rory and people like him is that he has an IQ of 110 and thinks he has an IQ of 130. This false arrogance drives so much elite failure over the last 40 years. And then Rory Stewart quote tweets that, and honoured to have my IQ questioned by you, Mr. VP, but your attempts to speak for Christ are false and dangerous. Nowhere does Jesus suggest that love is to be prioritised in concentric circles. His love is universal. Rory Stewart goes on to say, this is what made Christianity so radical among tribal religions. When asked, who is my neighbour, Jesus chose a Samaritan, an outsider and theological enemy of the Jews, as the moral exemplar to challenge the idea that obligation is primarily to one's own people or community. This does not mean that Christians should not care for their families. St. Augustine and Aquinas talk about why, for practical and emotional reasons, we focus on those closest to us, and they reflect on how difficult it can be to reconcile love with the demands of justice and mercy. But Christian love is radical precisely because it always extends to the most vulnerable and marginalized and to those we desperately do not want to love. Hence, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. The thread from Rory Stewart went on a bit longer. He sort of talked about, which I thought was quite interesting, sort of how there's this fundamental tension that sort of Christianity tells you it's not easy to do this, but you should constantly struggle between sort of partiality and impartiality. Aaron, though, I think your knowledge of Scripture is potentially better than mine. Whose side do you fall on when it comes to Rory Stewart and JD Vance battling this out?
Tory Rory, Michael. He's right. I think people that, are watching and listening to this, even if you're not particularly religious, you may have some sort of education at school or whatever, formal education at school with religion. Most people in the UK do. Love your enemy. Love your enemy. Pray for your enemy. Ask your enemy to forgive you. Forgive your enemy. Literally, that's in the Lord's Prayer, which comes from John the Baptist. So this idea that it's the concentric circles thing, which, by the way, it's an idea that comes from Cicero and it comes from Roman Republican theory. Love your family, love your community, love your nation, and then love the whole of humanity in that order. That's from Roman Republican theory. I think it's Cicero in De Officiis on public duties is the book. So it's actually a pagan idea. And of course that was integrated into later theological thinking. St. Augustine is not Jesus Christ. So it's stupid. That's not Christianity. You don't have to like it, right? You might call it woke, but whatever. It's literally there in the gospel. There's 4 books: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, laying it out quite clearly. Love your neighbor, love your enemy. Doesn't matter who they are. Don't make distinctions on the basis of their ethnicity. Most certainly, as the story of the Good Samaritan tells us. So yeah, nonsense. But we know this, Michael. I tell this to people all the time. If you're watching or listening, go online, or if you have a Bible at home, go look at the Epistle of James towards the end of the New Testament. Read it. It's only 4 or 5 pages. Sounds like Bernie Sanders on LSD, right? It's talking about how like the rich not just won't inherit, a favorable afterlife, but how they'll be smited from the earth. It's quite extraordinary language. He sounds like Mao. So it's not really a surprise that somebody like JD Vance has to appeal to Augustine rather than the actual scriptures themselves. And let's not even talk about it's harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. It's all there, Michael.
They need to get an Aaron Bastani cover quote on like a new edition of the Bible, like Bernie Sanders on LSD. He's like Mao. Aaron Bastani, co-founder of Novara Media. I think it would sell. It would sell very well, Aaron. Reach a new audience. Very interesting. I thought I didn't realize you'd come down quite so heavily in favor of Rory Stewart, but as I say, I started reading the book by what's his face, the guy who does The Rest is Politics, where he's sort of talking about how Tom Holland, that's it, where he's talking about sort of how radical the Christian faith was, and sort of like he starts it by talking about how the crucifixion on the cross, sort of worshipping someone who was crucified on the cross, was so revolutionary because that was actually the punishment for a slave, right? It was supposed to not just be cruel, and because obviously as a child when you learn about this you think, God, that's horrible and brutal, but it was also supposed to be incredibly humiliating, right? It's what you did to someone who was sort of considered worthless by society. And so he's talking about how the fact you idolize a person who dies that death which is supposed to be humiliating is just completely different from what came before with the Greek and the Roman religions. Well, obviously Christianity became a Roman religion, but the Roman pagan religions where sort of you're always worshipping great warlike warrior gods. And if someone were to claim themselves as sort of like a prophet and they died, that would prove, died a miserable death, that would prove they weren't really a prophet, because it would prove they clearly didn't have God's favor, because, religious, symbolic, godlike people are strong and heroic and win wars. And he's saying that's what was really different about Christianity. So very interesting. It has made me kind of want to read a Bible. I'll have to message you after it so you can tell me what pages I should skip to. Aaron Bastani, a pleasure as always. For all of you watching, thank you so much for tuning in. Have a fantastic weekend. Come back on Monday for another live show. After that show, I'll be doing a Q&A with Ash Sarkar. So have your questions ready. Until then, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.